Hi guys, today we're going to talk about conditional statement and different forms of conditional statement. Okay? As a mom or as a teacher, I always find myself saying something like, if you do something, then something's going to happen. I always tell my students, if you study really hard, then you're going to do really well on the test. Or sometimes I found myself telling Emma, which is my daughter, if you eat dinner really well, then you will get a delicious dessert. Okay? And that statement is called conditional statement. Okay? So conditional statement is, okay, if, then statement. Okay? So there are always two parts to that. Okay? There's if parts and then parts. And then if part is called hypothesis. And you guys learned it from science. It's just if statement. Then conclusion is then statement. Okay? So before you go over all these notation, let's actually take a look at some examples. So here's my example. When it is raining, then I'll take my umbrella. So the conditional statement of that is if it's raining, then I will take an umbrella. That is my conditional statement. Okay? But from this statement, we can actually manipulate this statement and then we can change into different forms. So first of all, what can we also say? Instead of saying if it is raining, then I'll take an umbrella, I can say if I take umbrella, then it is raining. Okay? So we can just switch the conclusions with the hypothesis. Then it's going to be if I take an umbrella, then it's raining. Okay? Sometimes we can also negate both hypothesis and conclusion. So if it's not raining, then I will not take an umbrella. Right? So what I did was I negate both hypothesis and conclusion. Okay? What can I also do? I can flip the hypothesis and conclusion and negate that. What do I mean by that? So I can just swap the hypothesis and conclusion, but I can negate them. If I don't take an umbrella, then it's not raining. Okay. So from this conditional statement, we can either switch the order of conclusion and hypothesis, or we can negate hypothesis and conclusion, or we can switch and negate them. Okay? And they all have different names. So the original statement, we call that conditional statement. But if I switch the order of hypothesis and conclusion, we call that converse. Okay? I always thinking of like, you remember commutative properties when you switch the order? Converse starts with CO. That reminds me of like commutative property. So if you switch the hypothesis and conclusion, we call it converse. Okay? What if we negate both hypothesis and conclusion from the conditional statement? We negate them, we make it not, we call that inverse. Okay? That's when we negate them. Now, the last statement is when you switch the order and negate both of them. And we call that contrapositive. So a lot of new vocab, correct? Then let's take a look at the notations. So when you negate something, we use the notation of like little wavy. Okay? Conditional means if, then is P, then Q. Is that right? Okay. Remember I talked about converse? What is converse? Converse is when you think of commutative property, so we are switching the orders. Then it's going to be Q, then P. Is that right? Then what is inverse? Inverse is when we negate them. So, negate the conditional statement. So it's going to be not P, then not Q. Okay? And contrapositive is we switch the order, then we negate both of them. Okay? So do you understand conditional statement, converse statement, inverse statement, and contrapositive statement? Okay? Then what is biconditional statement? Biconditional statement means it's including conditional and converse. Okay? So, conditional statement is P then Q, right? And then converse of that is Q then P. Is that right? So include both sets of statements. We call that biconditional statement. So it goes both ways. P then Q, but then Q then P. Okay? So we call that if and only if. And then we can use biconditional statement when conditional statement and its converse is both true. Okay? Then we can use biconditional statement. So here's how we're going to write this it's raining problem into biconditional statement. So how do you say that? I'll take umbrella if and only if. Okay? So this is how you write the biconditional statement. I will take umbrella if and only if it is raining. That is biconditional statement. And as you guys know, if and only if it's raining, that was the hypothesis. So that always goes with if, okay? Actually, it doesn't really matter if you can actually say it's raining if and only if I will take umbrella, but that sounds very silly. So we usually say conclusion first, and if and only if, and then hypothesis for biconditional statement. Okay? Then what does equivalent statement means? Equivalent statement is statements share same value. That have same value. So what you know about that is conditional statement and contrapositive, they share same value. So if the conditional statement is true, we know for sure contrapositive is true. Okay? Also, converse and inverse, they have same value. Okay? Let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at the one practice. Okay? So, conditional statement is if you leave early, then you will beat the traffic. Now, it's going to help you if you want to write the letters for each one. So if you leave early, that's going to be hypothesis here. So I'm going to put P. Then you will beat the traffic. That's going to be Q. Get that? Now, then second statement. If you beat the traffic, then you did leave early. So, you beat the traffic, that's going to be what? It's going to be Q. Then, you did leave early. That means it's P. So what is it? P then Q. Now it's Q then P. So what happened? It's going to be changing the order, which is converse. Okay? Now, if you did not beat the traffic. Okay, so if you did not beat the traffic one is Q, but you negated that, so it's going to be, okay. Then you did not leave early. That was a hypothesis, but you negated that. So what do we call that? When you switch the order and make them negative, we call that contrapositive. Okay? How about this one? If you did not leave early, so that was a hypothesis, but it was not, so you negate that, then you did not beat the traffic. Then it's not Q. What do we call that? Only we negated both hypothesis and conclusion, and we call that inverse. Okay? So, you can pause the video. You can finish the rest of the problems. Number 2 and 3. Pause the video. Okay, now you can check the answer for number 2. And answer for number 3. I want to briefly talk about number 3 though. If you read the conditional statement, if two angles are right angles, then they're congruent. Is that true? Yes. If two angles are all right angles, then they're congruent because they both measures 90 degrees, correct? Okay. Now, let's take a look at the converse of that statement. If two angles are congruent, then they are right angles. Is that statement true? No, because two angles can be congruent, but they don't have to be necessarily right angles, correct? Alright? Let's take a look at the next one. If two angles are not congruent, then they're not right angles. Is that true? If two angles are not congruent, they are not right angles. If they need to be a right angle, then they have to be congruent. Therefore, this statement is true. Now, how about the last one? If two angles are not right angles, then they are not congruent. That is also false, right? Because two angles are not right angles, and then two angles that are not right angles, like for example 20-degree angles and 20-degree angles, they're not right angles, but they are congruent. So that is false. Is that right? So what I mentioned earlier about the equivalent statement is if you look at the conditional statement converse and contrapositive and inverse, conditional and contrapositive, they share the same value. If the conditional is true, that means contrapositive is true. Same thing for converse and inverse. If converse is false, then inverse should be false. And that's what I mean by equivalent statement. We'll do more practice in class. I'll see you in class.